The island smelled of death. Bodies lay scattered across the beach like driftwood after a storm. Men, women, children. Their throats cut ear to ear, their eyes open to the merciless sun. Flies crawled across their faces in thick black ribbons. And there, standing ankle-deep in the warm shallows, was a man in a velvet coat. He was washing blood from his hands, humming softly to himself. Behind him, a woman screamed. He didn't turn around, he didn't flinch. He simply smiled and whispered to the waves, "We are building a new world here, and in this world, God is dead." His name was Jeronimus Cornelisz, a failed pharmacist, a bankrupt, a disciple of a convicted Satanist. In the next 60 days, he would murder 125 men, women, and children on this tiny strip of coral in the middle of nowhere. He would rape, he would torture, he would crown himself king of the dead, and no one was coming to save them. But how did a luxury merchant ship become a floating charnel house? How did 341 souls become 116? And who was the man in the velvet coat who turned paradise into hell? To understand, we have to go back 14 months, to a dock in Amsterdam, where the most valuable ship ever built was preparing to sail into the unknown. Amsterdam, October 1628, the greatest port in the known world. They called it the warehouse of Europe, a city built on wooden stilts driven into mud, where fortunes were made and lost before the morning fog lifted from the canals. And on this particular morning, cold, gray, smelling of salt and tar and money, the docks were alive with a kind of fever. The Batavia sat in the water like a cathedral made of oak and iron, 55 meters from waterline to masthead, 56 meters from bow to stern, 4 decks, 30 cannons, a lion carved from wood leaping from her bow, teeth bared, claws extended, frozen in eternal attack. She had cost the Dutch East India Company 100,000 guilders to build, more than 4 million in today's currency. And she had been constructed in just 6 months, a miracle of engineering driven by greed. The cargo being loaded that morning was worth even more than the ship herself. 12 wooden chests, each one containing 8,000 silver coins, Rijksdaalder minted in Hamburg and Amsterdam, destined to purchase spices in the East Indies. 250,000 guilders in total, a casket of jewels for the company's officers, silverware, fine cloth, pre-cut sandstone blocks to build a gatehouse in the new colonial capital, and people, 341 of them. They came up the gangplank in a river of wool and leather and desperation. VOC officials in starched collars, their faces pinched with ambition. Soldiers in breastplates, muskets slung across their backs, heading to garrison duty in a land they couldn't pronounce. Merchants' wives clutching rosaries, following husbands who had sailed east years before and never returned. And children. God help them, so many children. Cabin boys as young as 8, sold into service by families too poor to feed them. They would spend the next 8 months fetching water, emptying chamber pots, and learning that the sea had no mercy for the small. Francisco Pelsart stood at the rail of the quarterdeck and watched his future come aboard one trunk at a time. He was 32 years old, born in Antwerp, a companyman to his marrow. He had spent 7 years in India, trading and bargaining, and slowly climbing the VOC's ladder of rank. Upper merchant now, the highest civilian authority on any company vessel, commander of this fleet of 7 ships, responsible for ensuring the voyage would be profitable. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the rail. A fever he'd caught in Agra. It came and went, but lately it came more than it went. He had perhaps 2 years to live, though he didn't know it yet. What Pelsaert did know was that this voyage was his last chance. The directors in Amsterdam had grown impatient with delays and excuses. They wanted profit. They wanted spices. They wanted their investment to mean something, and they had given him the most expensive ship ever built to prove himself. No pressure at all. She'll sail true enough. The voice came from behind him, deep, phlegmy, carrying the particular contempt of a man who had spent his life at sea and resented anyone who hadn't. Pelsaert turned. Captain Arjan Jacobs stood there, arms crossed, jaw set like an anchor. Mid-40s. A master sailor who had completed more voyages than Pelsaert had eaten hot meals. His eyes were bloodshot. They were always bloodshot, and his breath carried the sour tang of Genever. It was 10 in the morning. "Captain," Pelsaert said, a greeting that wasn't quite a greeting. "Commander." A response that wasn't quite respect. They had met once before, 18 months ago, in India. There had been a disagreement, a public one. The details no longer mattered. What mattered was that Jacobs had been humiliated, and men like Jacobs did not forget humiliation. They buried it like a coal in their chest and let it burn. Pelsaert broke eye contact first. He always did. "We sail with the tide," he said. "Ensure the crew is ready." "The crew is always ready." Jacobs smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "The question is whether the cargo is worth the trouble." He wasn't talking about the silver. Her name was Lucretia Jans, and she moved through the chaos of the dock like a ghost through a fever dream. 27 years old. Wealthy. High-born. Beautiful in the way that started wars in ancient times and started rumors in modern ones. She was traveling to Batavia to reunite with her husband, a VOC merchant who had sailed east 3 years earlier, leaving her behind with 3 young children. All 3 children had died of disease within a year of his departure. Lucretia had buried them one by one in the frozen ground of an Amsterdam winter. And then, because she had nothing left to lose, she had booked passage on the next ship east. Pelsaert watched her board. Something flickered across his face. Admiration, perhaps, or something more complicated. She was, after all, remarkable. And he was, after all, only human. Jacobs watched her too. His expression was simpler, cruder. A wolf sizing up a lamb that had wandered too far from the flock. And then there was Cornelisz. Jeronimus Cornelisz climbed the stairs from the lower deck like a man ascending from a grave. 30 years old. Thin. Pale. The kind of face you forgot the moment you looked away, until you looked back and realized he had been watching you the entire time. He was listed on the manifest as under merchant, Pelsaert's deputy, a respectable position for a respectable man. But Jeronimus Cornelisz was not a respectable man. He had been an apothecary in Haarlem, a compounder of medicines, a healer, supposedly, until his infant son had contracted syphilis from a wet nurse and died screaming in his crib, until the scandal had destroyed his practice, until the debts had mounted and the creditors had circled, and his wife had looked at him with eyes that held nothing but ash. And then there was Torrentius, Johannes Torrentius, painter, philosopher, convicted heretic, the man who taught Cornelisz that all religions were lies designed to restrict pleasure, that God, if he existed at all, wanted mankind to indulge every appetite, that morality was a cage built by the weak to contain the strong. Terentius had been arrested in 1628, convicted of blasphemy, atheism, and Satanism, tortured, imprisoned, and Cornelisz, his devoted disciple, had fled Amsterdam before the authorities could ask questions about his own beliefs. He had signed on with the VOC because a ship sailing to the other side of the world was the perfect place to disappear. He had not planned to steal anything, not at first, but as he stood on the deck of the most valuable ship in the Dutch fleet, watching chests of silver coins disappear into the hold, watching Pelzart's trembling hands and Jacobs's smoldering resentment, watching Lucretia Jans glide past like a woman already half dead, something began to take shape in the darkness behind his eyes. A plan. On the 29th of October, 1628, the Batavia set sail from Texel with a fleet of 7 ships, 341 souls, 250,000 guilders in silver, 8 months of ocean between them and their destination. None of them knew that the ship was already cursed, that the captain hated the commander, that the deputy worshipped a convicted Satanist, that somewhere below deck, evil was taking root like mold in the darkness. They were 8 months from their destination. They were 14 months from hell. 6 months at sea. 6 months of gray water and gray sky and gray faces staring at the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony of endless ocean. The Batavia had become a floating coffin. Below deck, the air was thick enough to chew. 300 people crammed into a space designed for cargo, breathing each other's exhalations, sharing each other's diseases. The drinking water had turned green with algae weeks ago. Worms floated in every cup. The biscuits were riddled with weevils. You learned to eat in the dark so you couldn't see what you were swallowing. 10 passengers had died since Amsterdam. Scurvy, dysentery, fevers that came in the night and left corpses by morning. Their bodies had been wrapped in canvas and dropped over the side with a prayer that grew shorter each time. No one talked about arriving anymore. They only talked about surviving. And then, on April 14th, 1629, land appeared. The Cape of Good Hope. The southernmost tip of Africa. A VOC trading post where ships could resupply before the long push east toward the Indies. Fresh water, fresh food. Solid ground beneath your feet for the first time in half a year. The crew went mad with relief. Commander Pelzart went ashore to barter for supplies. He left Captain Jacobs in charge of the ship with explicit instructions. Stay aboard, maintain order, prepare for departure in 3 days. Jacobs lasted approximately 4 hours. Without permission, he commandeered a rowboat and made for one of the Batavia's companion ships, the Dordrecht, anchored half a mile away. He told the officer on watch he was there to coordinate sailing plans. He was there to drink. By the time the sun set, Jacobs had consumed enough Genever to kill a smaller man. His voice carried across the water. His fists had found 2 faces. His opinions on Commander Pelzart's leadership had been shared with anyone unfortunate enough to be within earshot. That miserly dog, he slurred to the officers who were too afraid to leave. That trembling, ink-fingered clerk, he thinks he can command men? He couldn't command a latrine? He spat on the floor. Were it not for the presence of other ships in this fleet, I would treat him so that he could not come out of his cabin for 14 days. I would make myself master of that ship inside a week. In the corner of the cabin, Jeronimus Cornelisz sat perfectly still. He had accompanied Jacobs to the Dordrecht. He had not touched his drink. He had not spoken a word. He had simply listened, cataloguing every slurred confession, every treasonous fantasy, every crack in the captain's armor. And when the other officers finally fled, and Jacobs slumped forward on the table, mumbling curses into the wood grain, Cornelisz leaned forward and asked a simple question. "And how would you manage that?" Jacobs lifted his head. His bloodshot eyes found Cornelisz's calm ones. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They were, in that instant, taking each other's measure. Jacobs saw a man of education and status who might be useful. Cornelisz saw a man of violence and resentment who might be controlled. Both of them were right. "The money," Cornelisz said. 250,000 guilders in the hold, jewels, trade goods, enough wealth to buy a kingdom in the right part of the world. Jacobs's eyes narrowed. The alcohol fog was clearing, replaced by something sharper. "What are you suggesting?" Cornelisz's smile widened by exactly 1 degree. "I'm suggesting that Commander Pelsert is a sick man sailing a cursed ship. I'm suggesting that crews mutiny all the time, and the VOC loses vessels to pirates every year. I'm suggesting that if the Batavia were to disappear somewhere in the Indian Ocean, no one would be surprised. We isolate the ship from the fleet. We turn the crew against Pelsert, humiliate him, make him seem weak. When we have enough men on our side, we strike. Kill Pelsert. Kill anyone loyal to the company. Keep 120 men to sail the ship. Throw the rest overboard." He paused. "And then we become pirates. We sail under the VOC flag, take what we want, and retire as rich men in some corner of the world where the company's reach cannot find us." "You're serious?" "I am always serious, Captain." Jacobs leaned back. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then set it aside. When he looked at Cornelisz again, his eyes were clear for the first time in months. "Who else?" "The High Boatswain, Jan Everts. He hates Pelsart nearly as much as you do. A few cadets who are young and stupid enough to think piracy sounds romantic. Some soldiers who are tired of being treated like cargo." Cornelisz counted on his fingers. "A dozen men to start, enough to isolate the ship. Once we're alone on the ocean, we recruit more. Promise them gold, promise them women, promise them freedom from the company that treats them like dogs." "And the woman?" Jacobs asked. "Lucretia Jans?" Cornelisz's expression didn't change. "What about her?" "I've seen how you look at her, how Pelsert looks at her." Jacobs laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Half the ship wants her. She rejected me 3 times already. Thinks she's better than a captain." Cornelisz was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She could be useful. Pelsart has feelings for her. Anyone can see that. If something were to happen to her, something public, something humiliating, he would be forced to act, to discipline the crew, and discipline breeds resentment." "You want to use her as bait?" "I want to use everyone as bait, Captain. That's how you catch monsters." When Pelsart returned to the Batavia the next morning, official complaints were already waiting for him. Captain Jacobs had assaulted 2 officers. He had been drunk on duty. He had made treasonous statements about the company and its appointed commander. The evidence was irrefutable. The witnesses were numerous. Pelsart summoned Jacobs to his cabin. "You understand," Pelsart said, his voice carefully controlled, that I could have you arrested, sent back to Amsterdam in chains. Your career would be over. Your family would be disgraced." Jacobs said nothing. His jaw was clenched, so tight the muscles jumped beneath his skin. "But I won't, not here, not now. We have a voyage to complete, and I cannot spare a captain." Pelsart paused. "This will be documented. When we reach Batavia, you will answer for your actions. Until then, you will confine yourself to your duties. You will not drink. You will not leave this ship without permission. Is that understood?" "Understood," Jacobs said. The word came out like a blade being drawn. He left without saluting. That night, 12 men gathered in the darkness of the cargo hold. Jacobs, Cornelisz, Jan Everts, the high boatswain who had been passed over for promotion 3 times, 2 cadets barely old enough to shave, a lance corporal and 4 of his soldiers, men who had been flogged for minor infractions and dreamed of revenge. They swore an oath, not to God. Cornelisz didn't believe in God, not to the company. They were about to betray everything it stood for. They swore to each other, to the gold, to the freedom that waited on the other side of blood. "First," Cornelisz said, "we isolate the ship. Captain Jacobs will steer us away from the fleet. A storm, a navigation error, it doesn't matter. We need to be alone. Then we need more men. We need the crew angry. We need them to see Pelsart as the enemy." His eyes found Jacobs. That's where the woman comes in. Jacobs smiled for the first time in weeks. "I know just how to arrange it." 3 days later, the fleet departed the Cape of Good Hope. They sailed southeast, using the strong westerly winds called the Roaring Forties to speed their journey toward Java. The plan was to ride the winds until they approached the western coast of an uncharted landmass called Terra Australis, the unknown Southland, and then turn north. It was a dangerous route. The winds were powerful but unpredictable. There was no accurate way to measure longitude. Crews had to guess when to turn based on sight and experience. Guess wrong, and you sailed straight into the Australian coast. Jacobs didn't need to guess. He knew exactly where he was steering them. By the second week out of Cape Town, the Batavia had been separated from its fleet. "Bad weather," Jacobs reported to Pelsart. "Couldn't be helped. We'll rendezvous with the others at Batavia." Pelsart accepted the explanation. It wasn't uncommon for ships to become separated. There was nothing suspicious about it, nothing at all. Standing at the bow that night, Cornelisz watched the empty horizon and felt something like joy. The ship was isolated. The conspiracy was in place. All that remained was to light the spark. In 3 weeks, he would destroy Lucretia Jans. In 4 weeks, he would throw Francisco Pelsart into the sea. In 6 weeks, he would be a king. He turned toward the sound and smiled. May 14th, 1629. 3 weeks out of Cape Town. The night was warm. Unseasonably warm for the Southern Ocean. A fat yellow moon hung over the Batavia like a lantern, casting silver light across the deck, painting shadows that stretched and shifted with the sway of the ship. Most of the passengers had retired early. The singing from the crew quarters was winding down. The watch officer stood at his post, fighting sleep, counting the hours until his shift ended. It was the kind of night that made you believe the worst was behind you. Lucretia Jan sat in her cabin and counted the days until she would see her husband again. 87, perhaps 90 if the winds didn't cooperate. 90 days until she reached Batavia. 90 days until she could stand before Budavine and tell him that their children were dead, that she had buried them alone, that she had crossed half the world just to feel his arms around her again. She set down the brush and looked at her reflection. 27 years old. A widow in everything but name. She had left Amsterdam with nothing but her maid, a trunk of clothes, and a hole in her chest where her heart used to be. The voyage had been difficult. The men on this ship looked at her the way dogs looked at meat. Captain Jacobs had cornered her 3 times already, in hallways, on deck, once outside the ship's chapel, pressing his body too close, his breath sour with alcohol, his hands finding reasons to touch her arm, her waist, the small of her back. She had refused him. Politely at first, then firmly, then with a coldness that made him recoil. He had not approached her since, but she saw how he watched her, how his jaw tightened when she passed, how his eyes followed her across the deck with something that was no longer desire. It was hatred now. Pure and simple. She needed air. The cabin was too small, the walls pressed in. Some nights, when the grief hit hardest, she couldn't breathe in that tiny wooden box. She would slip out to the deck, stand at the rail, let the wind dry the tears she refused to shed in front of anyone. Tonight was one of those nights. She stepped into the corridor. The ship was quiet. Most of the lanterns had been extinguished to conserve oil. She moved by memory, one hand trailing along the wall, feeling her way towards the stairs that led to the upper deck. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on wood, heavy, deliberate, too many to be one person. Lucretia turned. 8 men, faces covered with makeshift masks, rags tied behind their heads, holes torn for eyes that glinted in the darkness. They moved as one, spreading out to block the corridor in both directions. She couldn't run. She couldn't scream. "What?" she started. A hand clamped over her mouth. They dragged her. Down the corridor, around a corner, up a narrow staircase to a quiet section of the deck where the moonlight couldn't reach. She fought, kicking, clawing, biting at the hand, over her mouth. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong. They threw her down on the wooden planks. One of them knelt beside her. She couldn't see his face, but she could smell him. Sweat and tar and something chemical, something that burned her nostrils. He reached under her skirt. The assault lasted seconds. Hands groped her thighs, her stomach. Something cold and thick was smeared across her face. Tar, she realized, the smell unmistakable. Then something else. Something worse. Animal dung, packed against her skin, rubbed into her hair, forced between her legs. They were marking her, humiliating her, making her unclean in the most degrading way they could imagine. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. They left her there, covered in filth, trembling, staring up at the moon through eyes that couldn't quite focus. She lay on the deck for a long time, minutes, maybe hours. She couldn't tell. The ship swayed beneath her, and the stars wheeled. Overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang to mark the changing of the watch. Eventually, she stood. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out for help. Some part of her, the part that had buried 3 children, the part that had learned to suffer in silence, refused to give them the satisfaction. She walked back to her cabin. She locked the door. She filled a basin with water and began to scrub. She scrubbed until her face bled. She scrubbed until the water was black and the cloth was ruined, and her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold it anymore. And then she sat in the darkness and waited for dawn. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. But she listened. She listened to the voices of the men as they passed her door. She listened for the one voice she had heard through the chaos, the one she recognized. Jan Everts, the high boatswain. She knew his voice. She had heard him give orders on deck 100 times. He had been one of them. By morning, word had reached Commander Pelzert. He summoned Lucretia to his cabin. She came dressed in fresh clothes, her face powdered to hide the scratches, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking. Her maid stood behind her, weeping openly. Pelzart looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he stood and pulled a chair out for her. "Please," he said. "Sit." She told him everything, the corridor, the masks, the tar and the dung, the hands on her body, the voices she couldn't identify. Except one. "Jan Everts," she said. "The boatswain. I recognized his voice." Pelzert's jaw tightened. "You're certain?" "I am certain." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. Too careful. "Everts is a senior officer, respected by the crew, accusing him publicly." He paused. "There would be consequences." "You won't arrest him." It wasn't a question. Pelzert couldn't meet her eyes. "I will investigate. I will question the crew. But we are alone on this ocean, Mevrouw Jans. If I arrest the boatswain, if I accuse the captain of involvement, which I suspect, the crew will turn against me. There will be violence. People will die." He looked up at her then, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. "When we reach Batavia," he said, "I will report everything to the VOC Council. Everts and anyone else involved will face justice. Captain Jacobs will answer for his role in this. I am certain he was behind it, even if I cannot prove it." He turned back to face her. "Until then, I need you to be patient. I need you to be strong. Can you do that?" "I have buried 3 children, Commander. I know how to be patient." She stood. "And I know how to be strong." She walked out without another word. Below deck, in the darkness of the cargo hold, Cornelisz was waiting. "Well?" he asked when Jacobs arrived. "What did Pelzert do?" Jacobs spat on the floor. "Nothing. The coward did nothing. He questioned the woman, made some notes in his ledger, and told her to wait until we reach Batavia." He laughed, a bitter, disbelieving sound. "We assaulted the most valuable woman on this ship, and he's too afraid to act." Cornelisz didn't smile. He was supposed to act. He was supposed to discipline the crew. That was the entire point. To make him seem tyrannical, to turn the men against him. Well, he didn't. No. Cornelisz turned away, pacing in the narrow space between crates of silver. "He's smarter than I thought, or more cowardly. Either way, our plan has failed." Jacobs grabbed his arm. "What do we do? We've already isolated the ship. We have men ready. If we wait too long, we wait for another opportunity." Cornelisz pulled free of his grip. His voice was calm again, controlled. "Pelzert will make a mistake eventually. They always do. And when he does, we'll be ready." He looked toward the stairs that led up to the deck, toward the world above, where Lucretia Jans was walking back to her cabin, where Commander Pelzert was writing reports that would never be filed, where 300 people were going about their lives with no idea how close to death they truly were. "Besides," he said, "there's always the ocean." "What do you mean?" Cornelisz smiled then. A real smile. The smile of a man who has just remembered that God doesn't care what happens to anyone. "I mean that ships are fragile things, Captain. They strike reefs, they run aground, They break apart in storms. He paused. And when they do, the rules change. When they do, the only law is the one enforced by the men with the swords. Jacobs stared at him for a long moment. "You're mad," he said finally. "Perhaps." Cornelis's smile widened. "But I'm also patient. And patience, Captain, is how empires fall." Above deck, the crew adjusted the sails for speed. In her cabin, Lucretia Jans sat in the dark and remembered every voice she had heard. In his quarters, Pelzert wrote in his journal and told himself he was making the right choice. And somewhere ahead, 3 weeks away, hidden beneath the waves, morning Reef waited like a knife beneath silk. The mutiny had failed, but fate had something worse in store. June 4th, 1629, 2 hours before dawn. The night was perfect, clear skies, calm seas, a full moon painting the water silver from horizon to horizon. The kind of night sailors prayed for, when the stars were sharp enough to navigate by and the wind was steady enough to fill the sails without strain. Captain Arian Jacobs stood at the helm and watched the ocean roll beneath him like black silk. He had been drinking. Not enough to impair him. He was always drinking, and had learned long ago to function with alcohol in his blood, but enough to take the edge off. Enough to quiet the voice in his head that kept asking what he was doing out here, alone on an empty ocean, with a conspiracy that had already failed once. 3 weeks since the assault on Lucretia Jans. 3 weeks since Pelzert had done nothing. 3 weeks of waiting for another opportunity that refused to come. Cornelis kept telling him to be patient, to wait, to trust that the moment would arrive. Jacobs was tired of waiting. In the crow's nest, 50 feet above the deck, the lookout was fighting sleep.
His name was Hans Boschiter, 19 years old. This was his first voyage. He had been on watch for 6 hours, and his eyes burned with exhaustion. The moon was so bright, it hurt to stare at the water. Everything looked the same. Silver light, black waves, endless nothing. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Something white in the distance. A line of foam breaking against something. "Captain!" he called down. "There's something ahead! Spray, maybe, or—" Jacobs squinted at the horizon. He saw it too. A faint disturbance in the water, white against black. Could be a reef. Could be nothing. Probably nothing. "It's the moon," he called back. "Reflection on the water. I've seen it 1,000 times. Hold course." Boschiter hesitated. He was young. Jacobs was experienced. Who was he to question a captain who had sailed these waters for 20 years? He turned back to the horizon and told himself it was nothing. 3 minutes passed. The white line grew brighter, wider. The rumble became a roar, the unmistakable sound of waves breaking against something solid. Boschiter opened his mouth to shout. Too late. The Batavia struck Morning Reef at full sail. The impact was catastrophic. The bow rose out of the water like a breaching whale, driven upward by coral that tore through the hull like teeth through flesh. The ship lurched sideways, throwing anyone standing off their feet. Below deck, passengers were hurled from their hammocks. Cargo shifted. Crates of silver coins slammed against bulkheads. And then came the second sound, worse than the first. The rudder being ripped away. Francisco Pelsart felt the impact before he understood it. One moment he was asleep, fitful, fever-dreaming, lost in nightmares about ledgers and shareholders and children who wouldn't stop screaming. The next moment he was airborne, his body leaving the bunk as the entire ship seemed to leap beneath him. He hit the wall, then the floor, then something sharp that opened a gash in his forehead, blood in his eyes, darkness. The ship tilting at an impossible angle. He ran. Through the corridor, past passengers who clutched at him with desperate hands. Up the stairs, slipping on something wet. Blood? Seawater? Grabbing the rail to keep from falling. Out onto the deck, into moonlight that revealed the full horror of what had happened. The Batavia was dying.
She was impaled on the reef, her hull torn open in a dozen places. Coral jutted through the lower deck like bones breaking through skin. The main mast was cracked, leaning drunkenly. Water was already flooding the lower compartments. Pelsart could hear it, a rushing sound beneath the screaming. And everywhere, people running, praying, dying. A man near the bow made a decision. He climbed the rail and jumped, thinking the water would save him. The coral caught him instead. Pelsart saw him hit, saw the jagged reef tear through his body like he was made of paper. The man's scream lasted half a second. Then the waves pulled what was left of him under, and the water turned black with blood. Others were jumping too. Most didn't resurface. "Stop them!" Pelsart screamed at the nearest sailor. "Nobody jumps! Get the boats! Get the boats!" The man stared at him blankly. Shock. The inability to process what was happening. Pelsart slapped him, hard. "The longboat! The yawl! I need to get people off this ship! Now!" It took an hour to restore something resembling order. The ship wasn't sinking. Not yet. She was wedged on the reef, her hull torn but her upper decks still above water. The collision had happened at high tide, which meant they couldn't float off. When the water dropped, they would be completely stranded. But there was land. Pelsart could see it now. A small island, maybe 2 kilometers away. Barren, flat, but solid ground. Hope. "We ferry the passengers to that island," Pelsart ordered. "Women and children first, then the sick, then everyone else." Captain Jacobs appeared beside him. His face was pale, his hands were shaking. For the first time since Pelsart had known him, the man looked afraid. "You," Pelsart said. He grabbed Jacobs by the collar. "What have you done? That through your reckless carelessness you have run this noose around our necks?" Jacobs pulled free. "It wasn't me. The lookout saw the reef. He said, it was moonlight. I believed him." "You believed?" Pelsart's voice broke. He turned away, unable to look at the man anymore. "Get in a boat. Start moving people. If anyone else dies because of your incompetence, I will personally throw you to the coral." For the next 7 hours, the Batavia's 2 boats made trip after trip. The longboat could hold 40 people. The yawl could hold 23. They ferried passengers to the island, which Pelsart had already begun to call Batavia's graveyard in his mind, and returned for more. Women first. Lucretia Jans among them, her face blank, her hands steady. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply sat in the boat and stared at the wreck of the ship that had been her prison for 8 months. Children next, cabin boys as young as 8, clutching at anyone who would hold them. Infants passed hand to hand over the rails. Then the sick, the wounded, the dying. By midday, the island was crowded with nearly 200 souls. They sat on bare coral, sharp, broken rock that cut their hands and feet. There was no shade, no fresh water, no vegetation of any kind. Just a flat expanse of rubble stretching a few hundred meters in every direction, surrounded by ocean that sparkled with cruel indifference. Pelsayert walked among them. He counted heads. He assessed injuries. He tried to project calm while panic screamed inside his chest. They had salvaged some supplies from the ship. 150 pints of drinking water, some barrels of wine, salted meat, bread. Enough for a few days if they rationed carefully. But after that... They looked around at the island, at the empty ocean, at the people who were already starting to eye each other with the desperate calculation of survivors. This place would kill them all. At 2:00 p.m., 12 hours after the collision, the Batavia broke apart below the waterline. Pelsayert heard it from the island. A deep, resonating crack that seemed to echo off the water. He turned in time to see a section of hull collapse inward, followed by a rush of seawater that must have flooded the lower decks in seconds. 120 people were still on that ship. The screaming started again. Pelsayert could only watch as figures scrambled across the tilting deck. Some made it to high ground. Others didn't. The lucky ones reached the boats that had just returned from the island. The unlucky ones went into the water and never came up. 40 people drowned in the space of 10 minutes. By nightfall, the situation was clear. 260 survivors split between 2 islands. The main group on Batavia's graveyard. 180 people, mostly women, children, and civilians. A smaller group on a second island nearby. Soldiers and sailors who had been moved to make room. 70 men still on the wreck, unable to reach the boats in time. And Cornelisz among them. On the dying ship, Jeronimus Cornelisz surveyed his kingdom. The plan had failed. The mutiny would never happen now. Not here. Not with the ship broken and the passengers scattered. But as he stood in the flooded hold, watching water rise around the chests of silver coins, a new thought began to form. The money was still here. The jewels were still here. And somewhere out there, a rescue ship would eventually come. All he had to do was survive until then, and make sure he was the one in control when it arrived. On the island, Pelsayert made a decision. He would take the longboat. He would sail to the Australian mainland and search for water. If he found none, he would continue north, all the way to Batavia if necessary, and bring back help. It was their only chance. "I'll return as quickly as possible," he told his officers. "Ration the water, keep order, and whatever you do..." He paused, looked out at the wreck, at the men still stranded there. "Don't trust Cornelisz." On June 8th, 4 days after the shipwreck, Commander Francisco Pelsayert sailed away. 48 people in a boat built for 40. 3,000 kilometers of open ocean between them and salvation. He left behind a note explaining his actions. He left behind the jewels and coins that had been recovered from the wreck. He left behind 200 souls with no leader, no water, and no idea what was coming. The survivors watched until the boat vanished over the horizon. Then they turned to face each other, and the real nightmare began. The morning after Pelsayert left, the survivors woke to an empty horizon. They gathered on the eastern shore of the island. 200 desperate souls staring at the place where the longboat had disappeared, and waited. Some prayed, some wept. Most simply stood in silence, watching the water as if willpower alone could bring their commander back. He didn't return. By noon, the water rations were running low. Pelsayert had left behind 150 pints, enough for 2 days if divided carefully among 180 people. Less than a cup per person. The tropical sun beat down without mercy, cooking the bare coral until it burned bare feet. There was no shade, no shelter, no escape from the heat that seemed to press down like a physical weight. People started drinking seawater by the second day. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. Salt water didn't quench thirst. It accelerated dehydration, drove men mad, killed them faster than going without. But desperation has its own logic. When your tongue swells and your throat closes and every breath feels like swallowing sand, the ocean starts to look like salvation. 10 people died of dehydration in the first week. They couldn't bury them. The coral was too hard, and no one had the strength to chip graves into rock. So they laid the bodies on the eastern shore and let the tide take them. One by one, the dead slipped into the water and floated away, their canvas shrouds filling with air, bobbing on the waves like grotesque buoys. On the 6th day, it rained. The survivors scrambled to collect it. They used barrels, pots, helmets, cupped hands, anything that could hold water. They opened their mouths to the sky like baby birds. They pressed their faces to puddles on the coral and drank until their stomachs cramped. The rain lasted 2 days. It saved their lives. But it also gave them time to realize that Pelsayert wasn't coming back. Meanwhile, on the wreck of the Batavia, 70 men were waiting to die. Jeronimus Cornelisz was not among them. He had spent 4 days on the dying ship, and he had used that time well. While other men panicked, Cornelisz observed. While they prayed, he planned. While they wept for their families, he counted the survivors and assessed their weaknesses. The ship was breaking apart around him. Every few hours, another section would collapse, sending men scrambling for higher ground. The lower decks were completely flooded. The cargo holds were underwater, but the chests of silver coins were still there. He had watched them sink, marked their location in his mind. Recoverable. Eventually. On June 12th, the Batavia finally died. The keel snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The entire ship twisted, decks separating, masts falling. Men who had been standing found themselves in the water. Men who had been in the water found themselves pulled under by wreckage. 40 drowned in minutes. Cornelisz jumped. He had positioned himself near a section of mast that had already fallen. When the deck buckled beneath him, he leaped for the floating timber, grabbed it, and held on as the current dragged him away from the wreck. For 2 days, he drifted. He didn't panic. He didn't pray. He simply held on and let the current carry him, conserving energy, waiting for the tide to push him toward land. On June 14th, he washed up on the shore of Batavia's graveyard. The survivors rushed to help him. They gave him water, fresh clothes, a dry place to sleep. They treated him like a hero, a man who had survived the impossible, who had clung to life when 40 others had drowned. They had no idea what they were welcoming onto their island. Cornelisz rested for exactly 1 day. By the 2nd day, he was walking the island, counting people, noting who had weapons, who had food, who had authority, and who resented them. A small council had formed in Pelsaert's absence. A surgeon named Franz Jans had been elected leader, a popular man, well liked by the crew, but completely inexperienced in command. He meant well. He tried his best. He was exactly the kind of man Cornelisz knew how to destroy. "We need to ration food more strictly," one of the councillors was saying. "At this rate, we'll be out of meat in a week." "We can't starve people," another argued. "There'll be a riot." "There'll be a riot anyway if we run out completely." Cornelisz cleared his throat. "Forgive me," he said. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing." Franz Jans looked up. "You're the undermerchant, Cornelisz, yes?" "I am." He bowed slightly. "And as Commander Pelsaert's deputy, I believe I may be of some assistance." The council exchanged glances. The surgeon nodded slowly. "Please, join us." Within 3 days, Cornelisz was running the council. He didn't seize power. Not at first. He simply offered suggestions, solutions. His voice was calm, his logic impeccable. When others argued, he mediated. When decisions needed to be made, he was always the one who made them seem obvious. By the end of the first week, the council deferred to him automatically. By the end of the second week, he was elected leader by unanimous vote. "I know you're afraid," he told them. "I know you've lost everything. But Commander Pelsaert will return. Help will come. Until then, we must work together. We must trust each other. We must survive." They cheered him. They had no idea they were cheering their executioner. The next phase of Cornelisz's plan required followers, not the entire population. That would be impossible to control. He needed a core group, loyal men, violent men, men who would do what needed to be done without asking questions. He found them among the original mutineers, Jan Hendricks, a soldier who had signed the original oath on the Batavia, a man with dead eyes and quick hands, David Zevank, young, eager, the kind of man who enjoyed violence the way others enjoyed wine, Coenraad van Huysen, a cadet barely out of boyhood, but with a cruelty that made older men uneasy, a dozen others. Some had been part of the original conspiracy. Some were simply desperate, willing to trade their souls for a full belly and a dry place to sleep. Cornelisz gathered them all. "The rescue ship will come eventually," he told them. "When it does, we take it. But first, we need to prepare. There are too many people on this island, too many mouths, too many potential threats." He paused, letting the implication settle. "We need to reduce the population." "How?" someone asked. Cornelisz smiled. "Carefully, quietly, one group at a time. We send them to other islands, tell them we're spreading out to search for resources. Once they're isolated, they're no longer a threat. And if they find resources, water, then we deal with them differently." Over the next 2 weeks, Cornelisz emptied the island of anyone who might oppose him. 40 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were sent to Seals Island to the west, told there was food there, told they would be resupplied. 15 others were sent to Traitor's Island, the small inlet where Pelsayert had camped before his departure. And 20 soldiers, the strongest, most capable fighters on the island, all of them loyal to the VOC, were sent to the high island to search for water. Their leader was a man named Wiebbe Hayes, a private in the VOC army. Quiet, competent, the kind of soldier who noticed things others missed. As the raft carried him away from Batavia's graveyard, Hayes looked back at Cornelisz standing on the shore. Their eyes met, and Hayes felt something cold settle in his stomach, a warning he couldn't quite articulate, a sense that something was very, very wrong. "Find water," Cornelisz had told them. "Send smoke signals when you succeed. We'll come collect you." Hayes nodded, said nothing, but he filed the order away in his mind, alongside the growing list of things that didn't add up. The under-merchant's smile, the way certain men had started following him like dogs, the disappearance of the ship's weapons, all of them now locked in a single tent under Cornelisz's control. Something was coming. Hayes didn't know what, but he intended to be ready. Back on Batavia's graveyard, Cornelisz watched the soldiers disappear over the horizon. The population was now cut by a third. The strongest men were gone. The weapons were his. He had 130 people under his control, 24 loyal followers. All the swords, daggers, and muskets on the island. It was time to begin. On July 4th, 1629, exactly 1 month after the Batavia struck Morning Reef, Jeronimus Cornelisz dissolved the council. He accused 2 men of stealing wine. He sentenced them to death. And the killing began. July 4th, 1629. 1 month since the Batavia struck Morning Reef. The survivors had settled into a rhythm. They rationed water. They hunted seabirds and sea lions. They built shelters from salvaged canvas and driftwood. They told themselves that Commander Pelsayert would return any day now, that rescue was coming, that they just had to hold on a little longer. They had no idea that tonight would change everything. Cornelisz had called an emergency meeting. "We have a problem," he announced. 2 soldiers were caught stealing wine from the supply tent last night. Jan Pinton and his companion. They were seen by 3 witnesses. The council members exchanged glances. Theft was a serious offense. Supplies were limited, and hoarding could mean death for others. But execution? That seemed extreme. Franz Jans, the surgeon who had led the council before Cornelis's arrival, spoke first. Surely we can what? Cornelis's voice was soft, almost gentle. Forgive them? Let them go with a warning? And what message does that send to everyone else? We are 130 people with barely enough food and water to survive. Every barrel of wine, every piece of meat, every drop of fresh water, it's the difference between life and death. If we allow theft to go unpunished, others will follow. The strong will take from the weak. Order will collapse. He paused, letting the words sink in. I don't want to execute anyone, but we have no prison, no way to restrain them. If we let them live, they'll steal again, or worse, encourage others to do the same. One by one, the council members nodded, all except Franz Jans. This is murder, he said quietly. Not justice. Murder. Cornelis turned to face him. His expression didn't change. His voice remained calm. Then you are welcome to leave the council, surgeon. I'm sure someone else will be happy to take your place. Jans looked around the tent, at the other council members who wouldn't meet his eyes, at Cornelis's followers standing guard outside, at the world he no longer recognized. He said nothing. Cornelis smiled. Then we are agreed. The execution will take place at dawn. The next morning, Jan Pinton and his companion were brought before the survivors. They had been beaten during the night. Their faces were swollen, their clothes torn. They knelt on the sharp coral with their hands tied behind their backs, looking up at the crowd with the desperate eyes of men who knew they were about to die. Cornelis stood before them, flanked by David Zevank and Coenraad van Huysen. Both men held swords. These men have stolen from us, Cornelis announced. They have endangered our survival. The council has passed judgment. He nodded to Zevank. The sword came down. The first execution was over in seconds. The second man tried to run. Van Huysen caught him before he'd gone 3 steps. The killing was messier this time. 2 blows instead of 1. The man screaming until the second stroke silenced him. When it was over, Cornelis turned to face the crowd. This is what happens to those who threaten our survival, he said. Remember it. That afternoon, Cornelis dissolved the council. He replaced its members with 3 of his most loyal followers, Zevank, Van Huysen, and a soldier named Matti Speer. Men who had already proven they would kill without hesitation. The pretense of democracy was over. Over the next 2 days, 2 more men were executed. Carpenters, accused of planning to build a raft and escape. The evidence was thin. A conversation overheard by one of Cornelis's men, a few pieces of wood that could have been anything. But evidence didn't matter anymore. Cornelis pointed. His men killed, and the survivors learned to keep their heads down. My sword went through him as easily as butter. That's what one of the executioners said afterward. laughing, proud, as if he'd accomplished something worthy of celebration. The words spread through the camp like poison. Within a week, the rules had changed completely. Cornelisz controlled all the weapons, all the food, all the water. His men patrolled the island in shifts, watching for signs of dissent. Anyone who complained was noted. Anyone who resisted was killed. The survivors adapted. They had to. They learned not to make eye contact with the mutineers. They learned to give up their rations without argument when demanded. They learned to pretend they hadn't heard the screams that came from certain tents at night. They learned to survive by becoming invisible. But Cornelisz wasn't satisfied with obedience. He wanted loyalty, complicity. He wanted everyone on this island to be as guilty as he was, and he had a plan to achieve it. "The soldiers on the high island are a problem," he told his men. "If they find water, if they survive, they'll be a threat when the rescue ship arrives. 20 trained fighters, loyal to the VOC. "We could attack them," Zevank suggested. "Eventually, but first we need to reduce our numbers here. Too many people, too many potential witnesses." Cornelisz traced his finger across the crude map. "We continue the pattern. Send groups to other islands. Tell them we're searching for resources. Once they're isolated." He left the sentence unfinished. Everyone understood. The drowning parties began on July 6th. 4 men were sent toward the high island to assist the soldiers. David Zevank commanded the boat. Halfway across, in water too deep to stand, the 4 passengers were bound and thrown overboard. 3 drowned immediately. The 4th was offered a choice: swear loyalty to Cornelisz, or join his companions at the bottom of the sea. He swore. 2 days later, the same trap claimed 2 more men. Then 3 more. Each time, 1 survivor was permitted to live, but only if they joined Cornelisz's ranks. Only if they proved their loyalty by participating in the next killing. It was genius in its horrible way. Every new recruit was bound by guilt. Every survivor became a perpetrator. The line between victim and executioner blurred until it ceased to exist. "Go on," Cornelisz would say. "It gets easier." And for some of them, the ones who discovered they liked it, it did. Hans Hardens was a merchant, a family man. He had survived the shipwreck with his wife Anniken and their 6-year-old daughter, Hilitje. They had tried to stay invisible. They followed the rules. They kept their heads down. Hans had even signed an oath of loyalty to Cornelisz when asked, what choice did he have? But Cornelisz wasn't sure if Hans could be trusted. The man had a family. People with families had something to lose. Something that might make them hesitate at a crucial moment. So Cornelisz devised a test. On July 8th, Hans and Anniken were invited to dine with Cornelisz. It was presented as an honor, a sign of trust. Hans dressed in his best remaining clothes. Ken wore the jewelry she had saved from the wreck. They told themselves this was a good sign. that Cornelisz wanted them as allies, not victims. They left Hiletkia in their tent with instructions to stay quiet and go to sleep. While Hans and Anniken made small talk with a mass murderer, a man named Andreas Jonas slipped into their tent. Hiletkia looked up, smiled. She recognized him from around the camp, one of the men who sometimes brought food from the supply tent. "Hello," she said. "Are you looking for my papa?" Jonas didn't answer. He strangled her with his bare hands. She was 6 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She died because Cornelisz wanted to know if her father would break, and if he didn't, whether he could be useful. When Hans and Anniken returned to their tent, they found their daughter's body. The next morning, a mutineer appeared at their tent with a document. "Sign this," he said. "Swear loyalty to the council, or join your daughter." Hans signed. He never spoke of Hiletkia again. Not to anyone. Not for the rest of his time on the island. He buried the memory alongside her body and became exactly what Cornelisz needed. A broken man with nothing left to lose and no reason to resist. Anniken would not survive much longer. By July 14th, less than 2 weeks after the executions began, Cornelisz's men had killed nearly 50 people. The population of Batavia's graveyard had dropped from 130 to roughly 90. The sick were targeted first, their throats slit in the night as they lay too weak to resist. Then the old. Then anyone who seemed like they might cause trouble. And still, no one resisted. How could they? The weapons were gone. The strong men had been sent away. Anyone who raised their voice disappeared. But across the water, on the high island, something unexpected was happening. Something that would change everything. 3 smoke signals. The soldiers had found water. Cornelisz stared at the smoke rising from the distant island and felt, for the first time since the shipwreck, something like fear. They were supposed to die out there. They were supposed to starve, or go mad from thirst, or kill each other over the last drops of water. They weren't supposed to survive, but they had. And now Wiebbe Hayes, the soldier with the watchful eyes, was out there with 20 armed men and a fresh water supply. Cornelisz turned to Zevank. "We have a new problem." July 9th, 1629. 5 days after the killing began. The smoke signals hung in the morning sky like accusations. 3 columns of gray rising from the high island. The universal signal for success. The soldiers had found water. Cornelisz stared at them from the shore of Batavia's graveyard, and for the first time since the shipwreck, his plans felt fragile. 20 soldiers, trained fighters, led by a man who had looked at Cornelisz with suspicion from the very beginning. And now they had water, which meant they could survive indefinitely, which meant they would be alive when the rescue ship arrived, which meant everything could unravel. "What do we do?" Zevank asked, standing beside him. Cornelisz didn't answer immediately. He watched the smoke rise and dissipate, and he thought about all the ways this could go wrong. Then he smiled. "We accelerate the timeline. The people on Trader's Island, They saw the smoke signals, too. They'll try to reach the soldiers. We can't allow that. He turned to face his lieutenant. Kill them first. The survivors on Trader's Island never had a chance. 15 people had been sent there weeks earlier. Soldiers, sailors, 3 women, 2 children. They had been told they were spreading out to search for resources. They had been told supplies would come. No supplies ever came. By July 9th, they were starving, desperate. When they saw the smoke signals from the high island, they knew it meant water. Survival. They immediately began loading their 2 makeshift rafts, preparing to row toward salvation. They didn't see the boats coming until it was too late. "Stop," Zevank commanded. "By order of the council, you are not permitted to leave this area." The survivors froze. A soldier named Jan Karstens stepped forward. "We're going to the high island. They found water. We'll die if we stay. You'll die if you try to leave." Zevank nodded to his men. The killing began. The men died first, stabbed where they stood, their bodies thrown into the water before they stopped breathing. Some tried to fight back with bare hands against swords. They died faster than the others. The children were next. A boy of 8. A girl of 6. Van Huysen held them by the hair, while Zevank ran them through. Their mother watched. She screamed until a mutineer cut her throat to silence her. The 3 women were spared, if you could call it that. They were bound, gagged, and loaded onto the mutineers' boat. Cornelisz had given specific instructions. Women were to be kept alive. They had other uses. But halfway back to Batavia's graveyard, Zevank changed his mind. "Too much trouble," he said to no one in particular. "We have enough women." He nodded to his men. One by one, the women were thrown overboard. Their hands were still bound. They couldn't swim. They sank quickly, their eyes wide above the waves until the water closed over them. 12 people had lived on Trader's Island that morning. By noon, none of them were left. Back on Batavia's graveyard, the survivors had seen everything. The island was close enough that the screams carried across the water. Close enough that people could watch the tiny figures struggling, falling, disappearing. Close enough that children asked their mothers why the water was turning red. No one said a word. They understood now. There would be no mercy. There would be no escape. The mutineers would kill anyone they wanted, whenever they wanted, for any reason or no reason at all. The only way to survive was to be useful, or invisible, or lucky. That night, Cornelisz summoned his inner circle. "The Trader's Island problem is solved," Zevank reported. 12 dead, no survivors. Good. And the people on Seal's Island? 40, mostly women and children, a few men. Cornelisz nodded slowly. "They're too close to the high island. If the soldiers send scouts, they might find them. They might organize." He looked around at his men. "Tomorrow, we finish it. July 15th, 1629. The people on Seal's Island had been there for almost 3 weeks. 40 survivors, men, women, and children, who had been sent away from Batavia's graveyard with promises of food and water that never came. They had survived on rainwater and seabirds. They had built shelters from driftwood and canvas. They had told themselves that help was coming, that Commander Pelsiert would return, that this nightmare would end. They never saw the boats until they were already on shore. Zevank led the party. Van Huysen walked beside him, twirling a morning star, the spiked weapon the mutineers had fashioned from bent lead strips and long nails. Behind them came 5 more men, all armed, all eager. They had been promised extra rations, better tents, a share of the treasure when the rescue ship was taken. They walked into the camp like wolves into a sheep pen. The mutineers killed without hesitation. A man named Hendrik Dennis was, first, a sailor who had tried to organize the survivors into a defensive unit. A morning star to the back of his head dropped him before he could even turn around. His skull caved in like rotten fruit. 3 more men fell in the first 30 seconds, stabbed, bludgeoned, cut down as they tried to fight back with bare hands against steel. 6 boys, cabin boys, children, teenagers, tried to run for the water. The mutineers chased them down. Some were stabbed in the back. Others were dragged to the surf and held under until they stopped struggling. The women were not killed immediately. Cornelis's orders had been specific. Execute the men and boys, but bring the women back to Batavia's graveyard. There weren't many women left on the main island, and those who remained were already being used. 4 women were bound and set aside. One of them was heavily pregnant. Her name was Macon Sowers. Zevank looked at her for a long moment. "She'll be nothing but trouble," Histan said finally. "The baby, too." He handed his knife to a young mutineer who had hesitated during the killing. A test of loyalty, just like the one that had killed Hilitje Hardens. "Do it." The young man knelt beside Macon. She was weeping now, begging him in a voice barely above a whisper. "Please. Please, I have nothing. I'm no threat to anyone. Please, my baby." He took her hand, gently, almost tenderly. "Macon, love," he said, "you must die." He cut her throat in one motion. She bled out on the sand, her hand still reaching for the belly that would never bear life now. The other 3 women watched. None of them screamed. They had learned that screaming only made things worse. The other 3 women were killed shortly after. Zevank decided they weren't worth the trouble of transporting. 15 cabin boys had managed to hide during the attack. They crouched in bushes, in holes dug into the sand, behind rocks at the far end of the island. They watched the mutineers search for survivors. They held their breath until their lungs burned. 8 men from the camp had also escaped. They had a plan. 2 small boats hidden in a cove on the far side of the island, built in secret over the past weeks. When the killing started, they ran for the boats. They made it. The mutineers saw them go, but didn't pursue. They were too far away, and the high island was closer to the escaping boats than to Seal's Island. Zevank cursed. Van Huysen threw his morning star into the sand. But they had other problems now. 8 witnesses had just reached the soldiers on the high island. 8 men who had seen everything, who could describe every face, every killing, every atrocity. The soldiers would know now. They would know what Cornelisz had become, and they would be ready. Private Wiebbe Hayes listened to the survivors' accounts in silence. He had suspected something was wrong. He had felt it in his gut since the moment Cornelisz sent them away. But this, the systematic murder of women and children, the drowning parties, the torture and rape, this was beyond anything he had imagined. When the last survivor finished speaking, Hayes stood. "How many men does Cornelisz have?" 24, maybe more. They have all the weapons, swords, daggers, muskets. And we have? One of his men stepped forward. 20 soldiers, sir. 23 with the survivors. And the weapons we've made. They had not been idle on the high island. They had crafted pikes from driftwood, hammering nails into the ends. They had made morning stars of their own. They had collected coral rocks to throw. And they had built a fort, a 2-room structure of limestone and coral slabs overlooking the sandbank that connected their island to the smaller one next door. Hayes nodded slowly. "Then we prepare. When Cornelisz comes, and he will come, we'll be ready." Across the water, Cornelisz received the news of the escaped survivors. The second time in a week, his plans were crumbling. The soldiers knew everything. They would be prepared. They might even be planning to attack. But Cornelisz wasn't worried. Not anymore. He had more men. He had better weapons. And he had something the soldiers didn't. He had nothing left to lose. "Prepare the boats," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, we end this." July 16th, 1629. The day after the Seals Island massacre. Private Wiebbe Hayes stood at the entrance of the fort his men had built, watching the sun rise over the empty ocean. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, Commander Pelsaert was sailing toward rescue. Somewhere closer, too close, Cornelisz was sharpening his swords. Hayes had perhaps 45 people under his command now. 20 soldiers who had been sent with him. 8 survivors who had escaped from Seals Island. A handful of refugees who had trickled in over the past weeks, fleeing the horrors of Batavia's graveyard. And one boy, a cabin boy named Abraham Geritz, barely 13, who had watched his entire family die and refused to speak. They were outnumbered, outgunned, facing an enemy who had already killed more than 100 people without hesitation. But they had one advantage Cornelisz didn't know about. They had this island. West Wallaby Island was larger than Batavia's graveyard. Rougher terrain, covered in scrub and limestone outcroppings. And most importantly, it was connected to East Wallaby Island by a sandbank that only appeared at low tide. That sandbank was the only way to approach the main island without boats. And Hayes had built his fort directly above it. 2 rooms of stacked limestone and coral. Thick walls. Narrow windows for observation. A clear line of sight to anyone approaching across the sand. If Cornelisz wanted to attack, he would have to walk half a kilometer through ankle-deep water with Hayes's men watching every step. "Show me what we have," Hayes said. His sergeant, a man named Jan Willems, led him to the armory they had assembled. 23 pikes. Driftwood shafts, sharpened at one end, with iron nails hammered through the tips. Not elegant, but effective. 15 morning stars. Bent lead strips with protruding nails, attached to wooden handles by rope. The same weapons Cornelis's men had used to murder children on Seals Island, now turned against them. 200 coral rocks, each the size of a man's fist. Ammunition for throwing, and one knife. A small blade that one of the soldiers had hidden in his boot when they were first sent away. The only real weapon they possessed. "It's not enough," Willems said quietly. "It doesn't have to be enough. It has to be more than they expect." Hayes had never commanded men in battle. He was a private, the lowest rank in the VOC army. He had signed up for garrison duty in Java, not war on a coral island against a madman with a private army. But he had something Cornelisz didn't. He had soldiers, real soldiers, men who had trained together, marched together, learned to trust each other in ways that Cornelis's collection of murderers and opportunists never could. And he had clarity. Cornelisz was fighting for gold, for power, for the twisted vision he had inherited from his heretic mentor. Hayes was fighting to keep 45 people alive until help arrived. It's easier to die for something simple. "They'll come," Hayes told his people that morning. "Today, tomorrow, soon. When they do, I need everyone who can't fight to stay inside the fort. Don't come out for any reason. Don't make noise. Don't draw attention." A woman raised her hand. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow from weeks of starvation and fear. What if they break through? Hayes looked at her for a long moment. They won't. He was right about the timing. They came that same afternoon. 3 boats, 20 mutineers. Zevank and Van Huysen in the lead vessel, their weapons glinting in the sun. Behind them, a small flotilla of killers who had spent the past 3 weeks murdering everyone Cornelisz pointed at. They landed on East Wallaby Island, the smaller of the 2 islands, and began marching toward the sandbank. They didn't expect a fight. Why would they? They had slaughtered women and children without opposition. They had drowned families in broad daylight while survivors watched from shore. They had been gods on Batavia's graveyard, untouchable, unstoppable, invincible. These were just soldiers, unarmed soldiers, sent to die on a waterless island. How hard could they be to kill? Hayes watched them come. He had positioned his men along the ridge, hidden behind rocks, crouched in the scrub, invisible until the moment they chose to reveal themselves. The fort stood empty behind them, a decoy meant to draw the mutineers toward the most defensible ground. Zevank led the charge. He was 200 meters across the sandbank when Hayes stood up. "That's far enough," Hayes called out. Zevank stopped. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He had expected panic, flight, easy prey. Instead, he saw 23 men with weapons. Crude weapons, yes. Sticks and rocks and bent metal, but weapons nonetheless. held by men who were standing their ground. "You're outnumbered," Zevank shouted, back. "Surrender now, and Cornelisz might show mercy." Cornelisz showed mercy to the people on Seal's Island, to the children on Traitor's Island. Hayes raised his pike. "We've seen his mercy. Now let him see ours." He turned to his men. "Attack!" The mutineers had never faced resistance. They knew how to murder. They knew how to ambush. They knew how to kill bound women and sleeping children. But they didn't know how to fight. Hayes's soldiers did. The two groups met in the shallows, pikes against swords, coral rocks flying through the air, morning stars swinging. The water churned red within seconds. The first mutineer to fall was a soldier named Matthijs Beer, one of Cornelis's original council members. A pike took him in the gut, and he collapsed into the water, clutching at the wound as the tide washed over him. A second man went down moments later, then a third. The mutineers had better weapons, but they were fighting as individuals. Each man for himself. No coordination. No discipline. Hayes's soldiers fought as a unit. They covered each other. They advanced together. They drove the attackers back step by bloody step. "Fall back!" Zevank screamed. "Fall back!" The mutineers ran, stumbling through the shallows, tripping over coral, dropping weapons in their haste to reach the boats. Hayes's men pursued them to the edge of the sandbank, then stopped. They didn't have boats. They couldn't chase the attackers back to Batavia's graveyard. All they could do was hold their ground. But that was enough. When the boats were gone, Hayes counted his men. 3 wounded. None dead. They had driven off 20 attackers with nothing but sticks and rocks. That night, Hayes doubled the watch. They had won the first battle. But Cornelisz wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now, not with everything he had done. If a rescue ship arrived and Hayes's men were still alive, they would testify against him. They would see him hanged, Cornelisz had to kill them. It was the only way to survive. August 5th, 1629. 3 weeks after the first attack. Cornelisz had tried again and again. Each time, his men had been driven back. Each time, they had returned to Batavia's graveyard with fewer numbers and less confidence. The population of Hayes Island had grown. More survivors had escaped from Batavia's graveyard, swimming at night, hiding among the wreckage that still washed ashore, taking any chance to flee the nightmare. 45 people became 50, then 55. And with each new arrival came more stories, more horror, more proof of what Cornelisz had become. Aris Jans, the military barber who had been attacked on Batavia's graveyard weeks earlier, had finally escaped. "They tried to kill me," he gasped, clutching Hayes's arm. "Zevank and another man. Their swords were dull. That's the only reason I survived. I hid in the water until they gave up, then stole a boat." Hayes helped him toward the fort. "How many are left over there? How many innocent people?" "Maybe 30, 40. The rest are dead or his. He's killed everyone who might resist. Everyone who might be a threat. The women..." He stopped. Couldn't continue. Hayes didn't need him to. He knew what was happening to the women. Everyone knew. The survivors who had escaped had told him the forced marriages, the rapes, the women passed between mutineers like property. 7 women left alive on that island. 7 women in hell. And there was nothing he could do about it. Not yet. All he could do was wait. Wait for the rescue ship. Wait for Pelsaert to return. Wait for the moment when he could finally bring Cornelisz to justice. That flag flew day and night, a signal, a promise, a warning to any ship that passed. We are here. We are alive. And we are waiting. 40 days since the shipwreck. 40 days since Pelsaert sailed away. He had to come back eventually. He had to. August 1629. 2 months since the shipwreck. 6 weeks since the killing began. Batavia's graveyard had become something new, something that had never existed before, and, God willing, would never exist again. Jeronimus Cornelisz called it paradise. He had built himself a kingdom, the finest tent on the island, silk hangings recovered from the Batavia's cargo, silver plate and crystal glasses that had been intended for the colonial governor in Java, a bed of sailcloth and velvet, changed daily by servants who had learned that hesitation meant death, and clothing. God, the clothing. Cornelisz changed his clothes 4 times a day. Morning coat, afternoon coat, evening coat, sleeping robe, each one salvaged from the wreck, each one more expensive than anything he had ever owned in his former life as a failed apothecary. He wore rings on every finger, chains around his neck, a dagger at his belt with a jeweled handle. He looked like a prince, like a king, like the god he had always believed himself to be. His men had adopted the same habits. They wore silk shirts and officers' coats, strutting around the island like nobility. They ate the best food, salted meat and ship's biscuit that should have been rationed for everyone. They drank wine from crystal while the surviving passengers choked down seawater. And they had women. 7 women remained alive on Batavia's graveyard. Cornelisz had divided them among his men like spoils of war. Lucretia Jans, the woman who had been assaulted on the ship, the woman whose attack was supposed to spark the mutiny, had been claimed by Cornelisz himself. She lived in his tent now, wore the clothes he chose for her, smiled when he told her to smile. She had learned that survival meant performing, playing the role of a willing companion, letting her body be used while her mind went somewhere far away. The other women had similar arrangements. Judith Geisberts, wife of a ship's carpenter who had been murdered in the first week. Anneken Boskieters, whose children had been drowned in front of her. Svante Hendricks, barely 16, who had been married to a mutineer in a mock ceremony that fooled no one. They ate, they slept, they did what they were told. They waited to die or be rescued and tried not to think about which was more likely. Geisbert Bastiaens was the Batavia's predicant, its minister. A man of God who had survived the shipwreck with his wife and 6 children, the only complete family left alive. He had watched the massacres from his tent. He had heard the screams, smelled the blood, seen the bodies dragged to the water's edge. And he had done nothing. What could he do? He had no weapons, no allies, nothing but his faith, and faith didn't stop swords. So he prayed. Every night, while his children slept, he knelt on the coral floor and begged God for deliverance, for rescue, for the strength to keep his family alive one more day. God, it seemed, wasn't listening. "The attacks aren't working," Zevank reported. "Hayes has that sandbank fortified. Every time we try to cross, he drives us back." "How many men have we lost?" 7. Dead or too wounded to fight. Cornelisz drummed his fingers on the table. 7 men. Nearly a third of his fighting force. And Hayes hadn't lost a single soldier. "We need more men," Van Huysen said. "Or better weapons. The muskets from the wreck are underwater. I've sent divers 3 times. The water is too deep, the current too strong." "Then what? We wait for Pelsert to return and hang us all?" Cornelisz stood abruptly. He walked to the entrance of his tent, pulled back the silk curtain, and stared out at the moonlit camp. "We don't need more men," he said quietly. "We need fewer enemies." He turned back to his council. "The survivors. The ones who haven't joined us. They're a liability. When Pelsert returns, they'll testify against us. Every one of them is a witness." Zevank nodded slowly. "You want to kill them all?" "I want to remove the threat," Cornelisz smiled. "But yes, that means killing them all." The systematic killings began on August 10th. Unlike the earlier massacres, which had targeted specific groups, the sick, the isolated, those on other islands, this was comprehensive. Cornelisz's men moved through the camp with lists, names, ages, relationships. Everyone who hadn't sworn loyalty, everyone who might speak against them. They started with the men. Paskia van den Ende, Abraham Gerrits, Gillis Philipsen, merchants, sailors, men who had survived the shipwreck only to be murdered 2 months later by their own countrymen. Their bodies were thrown into the sea. Then came the sick. 3 men too weak to walk, killed in their beds. Then the elderly, a woman of 60, who had survived the voyage, the wreck, and the rationing, only to have her throat cut while she slept. By noon, 15 more people were dead. The population of Batavia's graveyard had dropped to 45. Most of them were mutineers. A handful were women. And one family, the Bastiaans family, remained untouched. For now. "The predicant has to go," Zevank argued. "He's a VOC official. If Pelsert returns, he'll be the first to testify." "And his family?" 6 children, 7 witnesses. Cornelisz considered this. The predicant had been useful, performing mock marriages between his men and the captive women, lending a veneer of legitimacy to the arrangements. But Zevank was right. When rescue came, Bastiaans would talk. His wife would talk. Even the children might talk. "Do it tonight. I don't want the others to see." July 21st, 1629. Shortly after midnight. Gijsbert Bastiaans woke to the sound of his tent being opened. He sat up. In the darkness, he could make out shapes. 3 men, maybe 4. One of them was holding a lantern. Another was holding a sword. "What?" he started. "Get up," the man with the sword said. "You're coming with us." They didn't take him far, just to the water's edge, where the coral met the sea, where they had killed so many others. Bastiaans knew what was coming. He had performed last rites for dozens of victims over the past weeks. He had blessed bodies before they were thrown into the water. Now, he was about to join them. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He prayed. The blow killed him instantly. His body crumpled forward into the shallows, the tide already pulling at his robes. Back at the tent, his wife heard the silence that followed the strike. She knew what it meant. She gathered her children around her. "Macon," she said to her eldest daughter, "hold your sister's hand. Don't let go. Whatever happens, don't let go." The tent flap opened. Zevank stood there, sword still wet. "Your turn," he said. They killed the mother first, then the baby, then the children, one by one, starting with the eldest. Macon was 12. She died with her hand still reaching for her younger sister. The youngest, a boy of 3, was the last. He didn't understand what was happening. He kept asking for his mother. He kept asking why everyone was sleeping on the ground. 8 people, 1 family, erased in the span of 15 minutes. Their bodies were thrown into the sea with the others. By morning, there was no sign they had ever existed. By the end of August, Cornelisz had killed or ordered the deaths of 125 people. Men, women, children, babies, the sick, the strong, the faithful, the fearful. 125 human beings murdered over the course of 8 weeks on a coral island the size of a football field. And still, Hayes's soldiers held the high island, and still Pelsaert had not returned. "Send another boat," he ordered. "Tell Hayes I want to negotiate." Zevank looked at him. "Negotiate? Tell him I want peace. A truce. Tell him anything." Cornelisz's smile had returned, but there was something desperate in it now. "Tell him I'm willing to surrender. And when he believes you? When he believes me, I'll be close enough to kill him myself." He turned back toward his tent. "One way or another, this ends soon. Either Hayes dies, or Pelsaert returns. Either way." He paused at the entrance, the silk curtain brushing his shoulder. "Either way, I am not going back to being nothing." September 1st, 1629. 89 days since the shipwreck. A boat approached the high island under a flag of truce. Wiebbe Hayes watched it come from the parapet of his fort, counting the men aboard. 4. No. 5. All armed, despite the white flag. And there, in the center of the boat, sitting like a king on a barge, Cornelisz himself. What's he playing at? Willems asked, appearing beside him. Nothing good. Hayes had received the message that morning, a survivor who had swum across during the night, carrying a note written in Cornelis's elegant hand. The undermerchant wanted to negotiate. He was willing to discuss terms. He wanted to meet in person, on neutral ground. It was obviously a trap. He thinks I'm stupid, Hayes said quietly. He thinks I'll walk into the open to talk, and his men will rush me. Then why did you agree to the meeting? Hayes smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Because he thinks I'm stupid. Cornelisz had dressed for the occasion, his finest coat, deep red velvet, salvaged from the Batavia's cargo, a silk shirt with lace at the collar, rings on every finger, the jeweled dagger at his belt. He looked like a merchant prince, not a mass murderer standing on the coral that had become a graveyard. He walked up the beach with his hands spread wide, palms up, the universal gesture of peace. "Private Hayes," he called out. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I think you'll find my terms are generous." Hayes walked toward him, slowly, deliberately. No weapon visible, no soldiers at his back. Cornelis's smile widened. This was easier than he'd expected. The fool was actually going to walk right into it. "I'm glad you've come to your senses," Cornelisz said as Hayes approached. "There's no need for us to keep fighting. We can share the island, share the water. When Pelsaert returns, Hayes interrupted. "He's going to hang you." The smile faltered. "I'm sorry? 125 people. That's what the survivors tell me. Men, women, children, babies." Hayes tilted his head slightly. "Did you really think I would negotiate with you?" Cornelis's mask slipped, just for a moment. "Then why? Because I wanted you to come here yourself." He raised his hand. 20 soldiers, armed with pikes and morning stars, positioned in a perfect circle around Cornelisz and his 4-man escort. They had been there the entire time, hidden, waiting, while Hayes walked into what Cornelisz thought was a trap. But the trap had been reversed. "Your men are outnumbered 5-1, Hayes said calmly. "If they move, they die. If you run, you die. If anyone reaches for a weapon, we'll all die together," Cornelisz finished. He had recovered his composure, or at least the appearance of it. "Is that what you want? Mutual destruction? I want you to surrender. And if I refuse?" Hayes shrugged. "Then you die here, and your men on Batavia's graveyard lose their leader. Either way, it's over." Cornelisz looked around at the soldiers, at their crude weapons, at their gaunt faces and determined eyes. These men had survived everything he had thrown at them. They had eaten seabirds and drank rainwater and built a fort with their bare hands. They had killed his men. They had refused to break. And now they had him. "I wouldn't," Hayes said. Cornelisz's hand stopped. "You're going to kill me anyway." "Maybe. That's for Pelsaert to decide. But if you come quietly, if your men stand down, I'll make sure you get a trial. A real trial, with judges and witnesses and all the formalities the VOC demands." He paused. "That's more than you gave anyone else." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cornelisz slowly raised his hands above his head. "Take the dagger," he said to Hayes. "Take whatever you want. But I want your word. A trial. Not execution on this beach." Hayes nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward and disarmed Cornelisz. The jeweled dagger, a small knife hidden in his boot, a garrote wire sewn into his belt. "You came prepared," Hayes observed. "I came prepared for anything." Cornelisz smiled weakly. "Except this." Hayes had captured not just Cornelisz, but his 4-man escort, including David Zevank, the most prolific killer on Batavia's graveyard. They were bound, searched, and marched toward the fort at Pike Point. The soldiers who had attacked the high island a dozen times were now prisoners. The man who had proclaimed himself god of the islands was being led away with rope around his wrists. "What now?" Willems asked as they walked. "Now we wait." Hayes looked toward the horizon, the empty, endless horizon that had mocked them for 3 months. "Pelsaert has to come back eventually. When he does, we hand these men over for trial. And if he doesn't come back?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Then we wait longer." They put Cornelisz in a small room at the Suren, back of the fort. Stone walls. No windows. A single chain attached to an iron ring that had been salvaged from the Batavia. He sat in the darkness for 16 days. No one spoke to him. No one brought him anything but water and a small portion of food, the same rations everyone else received. His silk shirt grew stained with sweat. His velvet coat became a rag. The rings were taken from his fingers, the chains from his neck. He had nothing left but his thoughts. And his thoughts were not kind. He thought about the men he had killed, the women he had claimed, the children who had looked up at him with confusion in their eyes before his men cut them down. He thought about the kingdom he had built and the empire he had imagined, sailing from island to island, taking what he wanted, answering to no one. He thought about Terentius, his teacher, rotting in a Dutch prison for the crime of believing that God was a lie. And he thought about what would happen when Pelsaert returned. September 17th, 1629. 105 days since the shipwreck. The watchman saw it first, a sail, white canvas against the darkening sky, coming from the north, from the direction of Java, from the direction of civilization. "Sail!" he screamed. "Sail on the horizon!" Hayes pushed through the crowd to the waterline. He shaded his eyes, squinting at the distant shape. One ship, moving fast, VOC colors visible on the flag. Pelsaert had come back. "Everyone listen," he called out. "That ship is going to pass Batavia's graveyard before it reaches us. Cornelisz still has men there, men with boats. They might try to intercept." The celebration stopped. "What do we do?" someone asked. Hayes was already moving toward the boats they had captured. "We get there first." It was a race. The rescue ship was approaching from the north, still several miles out. Batavia's graveyard lay between the high island and the ship's likely course. If the remaining mutineers saw the sail before Hayes reached Pelsaert, they might try to take the ship. They might kill Pelsaert and anyone loyal to the VOC. They might sail away with the silver and leave everyone else to die. Hayes rowed harder. The mutineers had seen the ship, too. A boat was already in the water, heading toward the rescue vessel at full speed. 10 men aboard. The last of Cornelisz's inner circle, the ones he had left in charge when he went to negotiate with Hayes. They were armed. They were desperate. And they reached the rescue ship first. When Hayes's boat finally reached the Sardam, the mutineers were already aboard. They had found Pelsaert. They had surrounded him with swords drawn. They were in the middle of explaining why the under-merchant Cornelisz should be considered the legitimate authority on the islands. And then Hayes climbed over the rail. "Commander Pelsaert," Hayes said, ignoring the mutineers entirely. "Private Wiebbe Hayes, reporting. I have a lot to tell. You!" Pelsaert stared at him. At the gaunt face, the ragged clothes, the crude weapon in his hand. At the soldiers behind him, who looked more like survivors of a siege than VOC troops. "Who are these men?" Pelsaert asked, gesturing at the mutineers. "Murderers, sir. All of them. They've killed over 100 people since you left. Men, women, children." Hayes met the commander's eyes. "And their leader is in chains on my island, waiting for you." The mutineers tried to argue. They claimed Hayes was lying. They claimed Cornelisz was the legitimate authority. They claimed they had only done what was necessary to survive. Then one of Hayes's soldiers, a survivor from Seals Island, stepped forward. "They killed my wife," he said quietly. "They killed my children. I watched them do it." Another soldier spoke. "They drowned my brother, threw him overboard with his hands tied." Another. "They murdered the predicant's family, all 6 children. The youngest was 3 years old." Pelsaert raised his hand for silence. He looked at the mutineers, at Hayes, at the islands visible in the distance, the coral graveyard where he had left 300 people to die. "Arrest them," he said. "All of them. We'll sort out the truth when we reach shore." The rescue had arrived, but the reckoning was just beginning. September 17th, 1629. The evening of the rescue. Commander Francisco Pelsaert stood at the rail of the Sardam and watched his crew ferry the survivors aboard. 116 people. All that remained of the 341 who had sailed from Amsterdam 14 months earlier. 225 dead. The number kept repeating in his head. 225. More than 2/3 of the passengers and crew gone. He had left them. He had taken the longboat and sailed away with 48 people, leaving the rest behind with promises of rescue. He had convinced himself it was the right choice, the only choice. Someone had to find water. Someone had to reach Batavia and bring back help. But in the 3 months he had been gone, 125 people had been murdered, and he hadn't been there to stop it. The survivors came aboard in small groups. Soldiers from Hayes Island, the defenders who had held the fort for 3 months against overwhelming odds. They walked with their heads high, but their eyes told a different story. They had seen things that would never leave them. Women from Batavia's graveyard, the 7 who had survived by becoming property. They came aboard wrapped in blankets, their faces hidden, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Lucretia Johns was among them. She hadn't spoken a word since the rescue ship arrived. Children. A handful of cabin boys who had hidden during the massacres. A few who had been spared for reasons no one could explain. They clung to any adult who would hold them, too traumatized to understand that the nightmare was over. And then there were the accused. Cornelisz, Zevank, Van Huysen, a dozen others. Men who had been identified by survivors as participants in the murders. They were brought aboard in chains, separated from the survivors, confined below deck under armed guard. Pelsaert watched Cornelisz board. Their eyes met for just a moment. Cornelisz's expression was unreadable, neither defiant nor defeated. Just empty. As if the man who had commanded a kingdom of corpses had retreated somewhere deep inside himself. "Put him in the hold," Pelsaert ordered. "I want 2 guards on him at all times. He doesn't speak to anyone until I'm ready." That night, Pelsaert began the investigation. He interviewed survivors one by one. He recorded their testimonies. He built a timeline of the massacres. Who had died, when, how, and at whose hands. Each account was more horrifying than the last. The drowning parties. The children killed in front of their parents. The pregnant woman whose throat was cut after being told, "Maken love, you must die." The predicant's family, 8 people, 6 of them children, murdered in the span of 15 minutes. He wrote until dawn. When he finished, he had documented 125 murders. 125 names. 125 human beings who had survived a shipwreck only to be slaughtered by their own countrymen. And at the center of it all, Jeronimus Cornelisz. September 19th, 1629. 2 days after the rescue. The trials began. Pelsaert didn't have a choice. VOC regulations were clear. Serious crimes committed during a voyage were to be tried on site, with the senior company official serving as judge. He couldn't wait until they reached Batavia. He couldn't transport the accused without first determining their guilt. So he set up a court on the deck of the Sardam, with the islands visible in the distance like silent witnesses. John Hendricks was first. He had been identified by multiple survivors as a participant in the murders, including the killing of cabin boys on Seals Island. He was young, barely 20. He claimed he had been forced to participate, that Cornelisz had threatened his life. The survivors testified against him anyway. "He held the boy down," one said, "while Zevank cut his throat. He was laughing." The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death, but not a quick death. VOC justice was specific about the punishment for mutiny and murder. Hendricks says would have both hands cut off before being hanged. A warning to others, a demonstration that the company's authority extended even to the most remote corners of the earth. One by one, the accused were brought before the tribunal. Some confessed, some denied everything. Some tried to blame Cornelisz exclusively, claiming they had only followed orders. The testimony of survivors contradicted them all. David Zevank, Cornelis's chief executioner, was found guilty of personally killing at least 20 people. Coenraad van Huysen, the cadet who had become a murderer, was found guilty of participating in the Seals Island massacre. Matthijs Beer, Lennert van Oos, Alert Jansen, Jan Pelgrom, name after name, murder after murder, and then, finally, Cornelis. September 28th, 1629. Jeronimus Cornelisz stood before the tribunal 11 days after the rescue. He had been interrogated repeatedly. He had given written confessions. He had described his plans in detail, the mutiny that never happened, the kingdom he had tried to build, the murders he had ordered. He showed no remorse. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Pelsaert asked. "I understand them." "Do you dispute the testimony of the survivors?" Cornelis smiled. It was the same smile he had worn when he ordered the deaths of children, when he had women dragged to his tent, when he had pronounced himself the arbiter of life and death. What would be the point? You ordered the deaths of over 100 people. I did what was necessary. Necessary? Pelsaert's voice cracked. Children, babies, the predicant's entire family. What necessity justified that? Cornelis's smile faded slightly. You left us, Commander. You took the boat and sailed away. You left us to die on that rock with no water, no food, no hope. What did you expect us to do, pray? You could have rationed what you had. You could have maintained order. I could have let the strong die alongside the weak. I could have let chaos consume everything. Instead, I made choices. Cornelis leaned forward. Hard choices. The kind you were too cowardly to make. You murdered them. I prioritized. There's a difference. Pelsaert stood. Jeronimus Cornelisz, you are found guilty of mutiny against the Dutch East India Company. You are found guilty of the murder of 125 men, women, and children. You are found guilty of theft, rape, and crimes against God and man. He paused. The sentence is death. But first, as befitting the magnitude of your crimes, you will have both hands cut off while still alive. When? Tomorrow. On the island where you committed your crimes. Cornelis nodded slowly. Then I have one request. You are in no position to make requests. Nevertheless, Cornelis's smile returned. I want to see it one more time. My kingdom, before you take it from me. Pelsaert considered the request. Then he nodded. Granted. You'll see it tomorrow, just before you die on it. October 2nd, 1629. 120 days since the shipwreck. The gallows stood where Cornelis's throne had once been. Rough timber, salvaged from the Batavia's wreckage. 2 posts, a crossbeam, a rope that swayed gently in the morning breeze. It had been built in a single day by survivors who had volunteered for the work, men who had lost brothers, wives, children to the man who would hang from it. Today, justice would be done. The survivors had been given the choice to stay aboard the Sardam. Most had refused. They wanted to see it. They needed to see it. Lucretia Jans stood at the front of the crowd. She hadn't spoken since the rescue, not a single word in 2 weeks. But when they told her Cornelisz would be executed on the island, she had walked to the longboat without being asked. She would watch him die. The condemned were brought ashore at sunrise. 7 men in total, the worst of the worst. Those whose crimes were so extreme that Pelsayert had sentenced them to die on the island rather than wait for proper VOC courts in Batavia. Mutineers, murderers, monsters in human form. Cornelisz came last. They had taken his hands at dawn. 2 hours earlier, as the sun rose over the ocean, Cornelisz had been brought to a wooden block on the deck of the Sardam. His right hand was placed flat against the wood. A carpenter's axe came down. Then his left hand. He had screamed. For the first time since the massacre began, Jeronimus Cornelisz had screamed like any other man. The sound had carried across the water to the island, where the survivors heard it and felt something they had almost forgotten: satisfaction. He couldn't walk on his own. The blood loss, the shock. He was barely conscious. 2 guards held him upright as they marched him across the coral toward the gallows. The crowd parted to let them through. No one spoke. No one jeered. They simply watched as the man who had murdered their families stumbled past, his fine clothes now stained with his own blood. His hands, the hands that had signed so many death warrants, lying somewhere on the deck of the Sardam. They stood him beneath the crossbeam. Pelsayert stepped forward, a document in his hands. The formal charges. The official record that would be sent to Amsterdam, to be filed in the VOC archives alongside 1,000 other tragedies. Jeronimus Cornelisz, he read, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Under merchant of the vessel Batavia, you have been found guilty of mutiny, murder, and crimes against the company and crown. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. Do you have any final words? Cornelisz lifted his head. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. A ghost of the intelligence, the charisma, the certainty that had convinced men to follow him into hell. He looked out at the crowd, at the survivors he had tried to kill, at the island he had ruled. Then he smiled. Revenge, he said. Revenge. No one understood what he meant. Was it a curse? A prophecy? A final threat from beyond the grave? Or was it simply the truth, that everything he had done, from the moment he boarded the Batavia, had been revenge against a world that had taken his son, destroyed his career, and left him with nothing but rage? He didn't explain. The noose was placed around his neck. The guard stepped back. And Jeronimus Cornelisz, apothecary, heretic, under-merchant, mass murderer, was hanged by the neck until dead. The other 6 were hanged after him. David Zevank, who had personally killed more than 20 people. Coenraad van Huysen, who had helped murder children on Seals Island. Jan Hendricks, Lennart van Os, Matthijs Beer, Alert Janssen. One by one, they climbed the scaffold. One by one, the noose was placed around their necks. One by one, they died. By noon, 7 bodies hung from the gallows on Batavia's graveyard. But justice wasn't finished. Waterless was 18 years old. Jan Pelgrim de Bij was even younger, barely a cabin boy. Both had participated in the murders, but both had also been identified as reluctant participants, forced into complicity under threat of death. They were too young to hang, but they couldn't go free. "You will be marooned," Pelsaert told them. "Left on the mainland of Terra Australis. If you survive, you will be the first Europeans to live in this land. If you don't..." He didn't finish the sentence. They were rowed to the Australian coast and left on a beach near the mouth of a river. Given a small boat, some provisions, instructions to make contact with the native people and learn their ways. Neither was ever seen again. They became the first European settlers of Australia, criminals abandoned on a hostile shore, swallowed by a continent that would not be colonized for another century and a half. On October 15th, 1629, the Sardam departed the Abrolhos Islands. The survivors stood on deck and watched Batavia's graveyard disappear over the horizon. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared, unable to process the fact that it was finally over. The island grew smaller. The coral that had torn the Batavia apart became a white line against the blue. Then a speck. Then nothing. Gone. Lucretia Jans would return to the Netherlands. She would live for another 40 years. She would remarry. She would never speak publicly about what happened on Batavia's graveyard. But those who knew her said she never smiled again. Not really. Not the way she had before. The Sardam reached Batavia at the end of October. The remaining accused, those whose crimes were less severe, or whose guilt was less certain, were handed over to VOC authorities for trial. Most were convicted. Some were executed. A few were flogged and released, their sentences commuted in exchange for future service. Captain Ariane Jacobs, the drunk who had steered the ship onto the reef, who had conspired, with Cornelisz, who had ordered the assault on Lucretia, was sent to Batavia in chains. He disappeared into the colonial prison system and was never heard from again. Commander Francisco Pelsaert wrote his report, 300 pages detailing everything: the voyage, the wreck, the massacres, the trials. He named every victim. He described every murder. He created a record that would survive for 4 centuries, ensuring that what happened on Batavia's graveyard would never be forgotten. He died less than 2 years later. Some said it was the fever he had contracted in India. Others said it was the guilt, the knowledge that he had left 300 people to die, that he had been gone when they needed him most. Either way, he never recovered. Wiebbe Hayes, the private who had defied an army of murderers with nothing but sticks and rocks, was promoted to sergeant. He returned to Europe a hero, his name recorded in VOC records as an example of courage and leadership. He never spoke of the island again. The Batavia was discovered in 1963. A fisherman noticed something strange on the seabed near Morning Reef. The outline of a ship, preserved in the clear water for 334 years. Archaeologists arrived, divers descended, and piece by piece, the wreck gave up its secrets. Cannons, coins, the skeleton of the ship herself, and bones. Between 1994 and 2017, researchers excavated multiple burial sites on the islands. They found the remains of massacre victims, men, women, and children, their bones bearing the marks of violence, skulls with blade wounds, skeletons with defensive injuries, the physical evidence of what the journals had described. One skeleton belonged to a pregnant woman. The blade had entered just below her left ear. Macon sewers. Today, the reconstructed stern of the Batavia stands in a museum in Fremantle, Australia. Visitors can walk beneath the wooden lion that once leaped from her bow. They can see the coins that were meant to buy spices in the Indies. They can read Pelsayert's journal, preserved behind glass, and learn what humans are capable of when civilization breaks down. 125 people murdered. 8 weeks of terror. One man who believed he was a god. And a handful of soldiers who proved him wrong. The Abrolhos Islands are a protected marine reserve now. Tourists come to dive the wreck, to swim with sea lions, to marvel at the coral that tore the Batavia apart. Most of them don't know what happened here. Most of them see only beauty. The turquoise water, the white sand, the endless sky. But sometimes, when the wind shifts and the light falls just right, you can almost hear them, the screaming, the prayers, the silence that followed. And somewhere beneath the waves, in the scattered remains of a ship that was supposed to change the world, Jeronimus Cornelisz's coins still glitter in the dark, waiting. The Batavia massacre remains one of the most disturbing chapters in maritime history. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a choice, made by one man, enabled by others, inflicted on the innocent. Jeronimus Cornelisz believed that morality was a cage, that the strong had the right to rule the weak, that God, if he existed at all, didn't care what happened on a coral island at the edge of the known world. He was wrong, not because God intervened, not because justice was inevitable, but because ordinary people, soldiers, sailors, survivors, refused to accept his vision. Wiebbe Hayes was a private, the lowest rank, a nobody. He had no authority, no weapons, no reason to believe he could win. But he fought anyway, and because he fought, 116 people lived to tell the story. Some stories have heroes. Some stories have villains. This story had both. And it asks a question that still matters, 4 centuries later. When the rules disappear, when no one is watching, when you could be anything you wanted to be, what would you become?